Huang Feihong, a household name, is a superhero to the Chinese people. The Huang Feihong series, rather than being just kung fu movies, can be seen as the awakening of the Chinese people, representing the spirit of the Chinese nation. From now on, I'll refer to Huang Feihong as Li. The story takes place in the late Qing Dynasty. At that time, the West was advanced, symbolized by firearms, cannons, phonographs, and so on. In contrast, China, which had been closed off for over 200 years, was considerably backward in terms of technology and economy. While the closed gates were opened, unfortunately, they were opened by gunfire. Faced with the Westerners' advanced weaponry, the Qing government had no means of resistance. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, Macau to Portugal, and Russia took control of the Black Dragon River. Like sharks smelling blood, they targeted this golden land. Various ideologies, cultures, and powers clashed, making China's pawn turbulent. Li was born in this era. He was a coach for the Guangdong militia and a subordinate of the national hero Lao, which is consistent with history. Historical records show that Li served as a martial arts coach in the Black Flag Army, while Lao, who was 10 years older, was the leader of the Black Flag Army. He had participated in the resistance against the French in Vietnam and joined the anti-ceding Taiwan movement after the Qing government ceded Taiwan. Li's story takes place during the resistance against the French in Vietnam. Before leaving, Lao entrusted Li with a fan, where the 5 characters of unequal treaty glaringly displayed the hero's sorrow. Li organized the Black Flag Army into a militia, hoping that by the time he returned, these unequal treaties would have been nullified. Li kept his promise to Lao by training the militia locally and establishing his own traditional Chinese medicine clinic, Baozilan. However, the clash between Chinese and Western cultures and the rapid changes of the times made the usually conservative Li puzzled. Li at this time is a true portrayal of the Chinese people of that era. They were very resistant to foreign cultures, not seeking to understand, but choosing to deny. So when Rosamund returned from abroad and specifically brought Li a Western suit, Li instinctively refused, saying he would only wear it after all Chinese people started wearing Western suits. Of course, Li's conservatism would soon be harshly educated. One day, a wounded man arrived at the clinic, a laborer from the docks who had been shot by Western soldiers because he couldn't distinguish between foreign flags and boarded the wrong ship. However, due to the incompetence of the Qing court at the time, the common people could only endure silently. Although Li was strong in martial arts, he knew that fists and kicks couldn't solve the problem. So, as a representative of the militia, Li decided to negotiate with the local authorities and the Westerners. However, the Westerners turned the tables, and the Qing government officials, who should have upheld justice for the people, had already sided with the Westerners. At this point, a group of people started fighting inside the meeting place. And another important character appeared, a young man named Kuan. Kuan, who came from Foshan, worked as a martial artist in a theater troupe and had encountered harassment from local gangs. Taking advantage of the chaotic times, these gangs rose to power, causing trouble locally and exploiting the people. Kuan wanted to resist, but they outnumbered him, so he had to flee, meeting Li's disciples on the way. One side was a gang organization, the other side was local militia, and they immediately began fighting, eventually barging into the venue where Li was negotiating with the Westerners. In the chaos, Heir 2 met the Westerners' bodyguards and was beaten badly by them. Li stood up for his disciple, but ended up in conflict with the Westerners. The reprimanded official didn't care, believing that it was all the militia's fault, so he arrested all the militia members and revoked Li's jurisdiction. Faced with the government and the Westerners, the physically strong Li felt deeply powerless. That night, looking at the fan with the unequal treaty, Li fell into contemplation. The next day, the local gang was extorting protection money at a tea house when Li happened to pass by. Without hesitation, he intervened and beat them up. After subduing them, Li hoped that the surrounding people would bear witness, but as soon as he spoke, the onlookers dispersed. It was only at this moment that Li realized that as despicable as the Western invasion was, the people's silent endurance was equally hopeless. And on this very night, Li faced retaliation from the gang. Dozens of rockets were fired at the clinic. Li and his disciples rushed to extinguish the fire, but due to the intense flames, they could only watch helplessly as the clinic was reduced to ashes. What's more ironic was that Lao's fan had already been burnt, turning the unequal treaty into an equal one. This scene deeply wounded Li. The clinic was burned, the paper fan destroyed, and everything symbolizing tradition and national dignity was gone. In his unprecedented confusion, Li vented his anger on the Western gadgets brought by Rosamund. At this moment, a priest passed by the door, and he stepped forward to claim that he knew who burned down the clinic. With the testimony of the priest, the authorities began to arrest the arsonists, and the local gang realized that if they wanted to survive, they had to find the biggest backer. So they turned to the Westerners, becoming accomplices of the Westerners in the country, specializing in capturing Chinese women and selling them overseas. After the local gang joined forces with the foreigners, as part of the deal, the foreigners wanted them to get rid of Li. So, they deliberately set up a trap, inviting Li to watch a play at the theater. Midway through, the gang launched an attack, intending to shoot him amidst the chaos. However, what the foreigners didn't anticipate was Li's extraordinary martial prowess. He managed to fend off all the assassination attempts by the gang, prompting the foreigners to intervene. Just as they were about to shoot, nearby priest blocked the bullet, causing a gunshot that plunged the theater into chaos. The foreign soldiers, who were there to protect their officers, immediately aimed their guns at the Chinese audience below, regardless of whether they were criminals or civilians. When the governor arrived, the gang had already fled, and once again, the blame fell on Li. The governor was prepared to throw Li into prison, but Li pleaded for some time to first take the injured civilians to the clinic for treatment. Unfortunately, many of the injured were too severely wounded and had already passed away before they could receive timely treatment. It was only at this moment that Li transformed from being traditionally conservative to actively accepting new ideas. The clash between reality and ideals led him to new reflections. Although there may not be a distinction between superiority and inferiority between East and West, there is at least a difference between advancement and backwardness. So, Li told Rosamund that China needed to change because fists and kicks couldn't compete with guns and cannons. During this time, another character emerged, Yan from Shandong. Despite Yan's formidable martial arts skills and his invincible iron body technique, in this chaotic world, his martial prowess only earned him meager coins on the ground. So, even though Yan could easily defeat opponents in duels, he would soon find himself squatting on the street, hungry and waiting for leftover noodle soup. The hardships of life drove this hero to seek fame and fortune desperately. Yan abandoned his moral bottom line and completely embarked on the wrong path. So, Kuan brought his master Yan to the clinic and challenged Li. But Li didn't want to fight because there were still many patients in the clinic. However, Yan, eager to establish his reputation quickly, ignored Li's words and directly started fighting. Rosamund tried to stop Yan with a foreign gun, but she was snatched by Kuan, and the sound of the gun drew Li's attention. Yan took advantage of this and kicked him away, then proceeded to destroy the clinic signboard, breaking it in half with one kick. After defeating Li, Yan felt that everything was too easy. So he decided to continue the battle on the street tomorrow. Li didn't argue back, he knew the nature of the authorities. Since the guard was injured by Yan, Li knew he would be held responsible. So, he instructed his disciples to take Rosamund and leave first. As expected, shortly afterward, the officials quickly assembled and aggressively stormed into the clinic. In order to buy her time, Li, who had been accommodating everywhere, finally fought back against the authorities for the first time, leading to his imprisonment by the governor. Meanwhile, Yan, who had defeated Li, caught the attention of the local gang, who urgently needed a martial arts expert as their figurehead. They hired Yan as their teacher, but in reality, they didn't truly respect him, they just wanted to use his victory over Li as a facade for the gang's protection racket. Kuan, knowing the gang's actions, wanted Yan to reconsider before accepting them as disciples. However, Yan was no longer receptive, he believed that the most important thing now was to make a name for himself, as only by doing so could he uphold justice for all. Feeling conflicted, Kuan recalled the gang's past deeds and angrily threw away the coins. As he prepared to leave, he unexpectedly saw Rosamund naked. It turned out that after she left the clinic that day, she was captured by the gang, who mistook her for a slave. Out of hatred for Li, the gang leader intended to harm Rosamund, leading to the scene unfolding before them. Angered, Kuan stormed into the room and attacked the gang leader. Then prepared to escape with her. However, with their large numbers and the help of Master Yan, the two were quickly captured, and Kuan was suspended and beaten. As Rosamund was about to suffer, Li finally made his heroic entrance. Previously, Li had clashed with the authorities, and the governor ordered him to be imprisoned. However, some soldiers who admired Li's character secretly planned to release him without the higher-ups' knowledge. Initially, Li didn't want to drag the soldiers down, but when he received news that Rosamund had been abducted, Li had no choice but to escape in order to rescue her. Thus, in the warehouse, the two sides engaged in the ultimate battle, with Li once again confronting Yan. Last time, Yan had taken advantage of Li's distraction to defeat him with ease, but this time, when they truly fought, Yan realized he was no match. In pursuit of fame and fortune, he abandoned the dignity of martial arts and began resorting to dirty tricks, such as hiding a small knife in his braid. Seeing that Yan was resorting to any means necessary, Li also stopped holding back and used his renowned Foshan shadowless kick technique, leaving Yan severely injured. Meanwhile, as the two fought, Rosamund was taken aboard a foreign ship. After dealing with Yan, Li hurried to rescue Rosamund, only to encounter a firing squad as soon as he stepped out. Yan, who refused to accept defeat, demanded another fight, but as soon as he stepped outside, he was attacked by foreign guns. Even Yan's proud iron body technique was pierced by the bullets, leading to his final reflection with Li. When he first arrived here, he had dreams of being a knight, willing to earn a hard living by performing. At that time, although Yan performed on the streets, his heart was full of resilience. However, when hunger came at night, Yan picked up the bowl of leftover scraps and listened to the mocking remarks of the brothel madam. At that moment, he gave up his principles and dignity, believing that once he became wealthy, he could uphold justice for all. After Yan's death, Li jumped into the cabin to rescue Rosamund, only to be blocked by foreigners with guns. Seeing Li break in, the gang leader attempted to throw her into the furnace, but in a critical moment, the slave women united and pushed the gang leader into the fire. On the other side, the foreigners held the arriving Qing governor hostage, and under his coercion, Li reluctantly put down his gun. However, he kept a trick up his sleeve, shooting a bullet into the foreigner's forehead with a flick of his finger. The true villain ultimately met his deserved fate. With all crises resolved, the governor and Li reconciled, standing together at the bow of the ship, reflecting on their journey. If the previous Li upheld national integrity, the current him has accepted change. Li put on the disliked Western suit and took a photo with his disciples and others. At this moment, Li has realized the shortcomings and understands that China is very backward. This country must accept foreign culture, but how to regain its strength is something that Li has not yet figured out.